My son secretly stopped going to medical school and spent my money partying instead. Now he wants me to help him once more. I gave up everything I had to put my son Ethan through medical school. I sold my rental property, drained my retirement account early and paid the penalty without hesitation, worked double shifts as a nurse until my legs ached and my hands shook, moved myself into a cramped one-bedroom apartment so he could live comfortably and focus on studying. Every month I sent him $5,000 without fail. Tuition, rent, food, books, all of it covered. He promised me that one day he would take care of me when he became a doctor. He called me his hero. Told me he studied every night, sent photos in scrubs, talked about rotations, professors, long hours. I believed every word, and I was proud beyond measure. My son, the future doctor, 3 years of payments, $180,000, every cent I had saved for retirement gone because I believed in him completely. Then, last month everything collapsed in a grocery store aisle. I ran into the mother of someone she called Ethan roommate. She smiled and casually mentioned how nice it was that Ethan and her son were building an entertainment company together. The words did not make sense. What roommate? What company? Ethan lived alone so he could focus on school. She looked at me like I was the one confused and said her son had lived with Ethan for 3 years. They threw parties every weekend and ran a DJ business together. My stomach dropped as realization crept in. Ethan had not been in medical school since his first semester. He failed anatomy and dropped out without telling me. For 3 years he collected my money and spent it on equipment, parties, trips to Miami and Vegas, while I ate rice and beans and skipped vacations to afford his fake tuition. And I called the medical school with shaking hands and they confirmed he withdrew in 2021. The registrar said letters had been sent to his permanent address. My address. Ethan had intercepted my mail for years. I drove to his apartment that night, his real apartment, not the studio I had been paying for. It was a luxury penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, music equipment everywhere, professional DJ set up recording booth and 3 roommates I had never met. Ethan was in the living room mixing tracks and when he saw me he did not look shocked or guilty, just annoyed that I showed up unannounced. I asked about medical school and he shrugged like it was nothing. Said it was not for him, too much memorization, too many rules. He said he found his real passion in music and called himself an artist. I asked about the $180,000 I gave him and he said it was an investment in his future. The money helped him network, build his brand, buy equipment. He said his business was taking off and he made $30,000 last year, only $150,000 less than what I gave him. When I started crying he told me to stop being manipulative. Said parents support their kids' dreams and I should be proud he found his calling. His roommates agreed and joked about how cool it was that I funded his journey. Like I knew what I was funding, like I had a choice. I left without saying anything else because I needed time to process the betrayal, the lies, the years of exhaustion and sacrifice that were stolen from me. For 2 weeks he did not call or text. Then yesterday he called with excitement in his voice. He said he had big news. A famous DJ wanted to collaborate and they could tour together, open a studio, build an empire. He just needed startup capital. $50,000. He said since I already invested so much in his education, what was a little more for his actual career. He promised to pay me back double when he made it big. The same promise he made about becoming a doctor. I told him I would think about it and he said there was no time to think. This was his shot, our shot. We were a team and I was not just his mother but his business partner. I asked him to meet me at my apartment to discuss terms and he arrived in a Tesla saying it was for his image. Part of the business. He brought contracts and spreadsheets and spoke for an hour about his vision, his destiny, his talent. He talked about follower counts and played his latest tracks. Said the universe was rewarding my faith in him. I listened quietly and let him finish. Then I handed him an envelope. Inside were 3 documents, a cease and contact letter on law firm letterhead, a spreadsheet listing every payment I made with dates and amounts, and a small claims court filing for the maximum allowed in our state. His confident smile disappeared as he flipped through the pages and his hands began to shake. He laughed nervously and said I could not sue my own son. His tone sharp now. I told him my attorney, Samuel Carter, explained that fraud is fraud no matter who commits it. Family does not change the law. I had years of documented lies, intercepted mail, fake photos, and stories saved and organized. His laughter stopped and he switched tactics immediately. Tears streamed down his face and he said he thought I believed in him, that parents are supposed to support their kids' passions. I stayed silent and watched him perform, remembering how he cried the same way when he showed me his fake acceptance letter years ago. Back then I hugged him and told him I was proud. Now I let the silence speak when the tears failed his face, hardened with anger, and he stood up. So fast his chair scraped the floor. He said if I went through with this I would never see him again. He would cut me out of his life completely. I told him he already did that 3 years ago when he chose to steal from me instead of being honest. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door as he shouted that I was ruining his life and destroying his future. His roommates emerged from their rooms looking shocked, and one of them, Tyler, said quietly they did not know the money came from me. Ethan told them it was a trust fund. I left without another word and sat in my car, shaking but feeling something new, underneath the fear. That night, I called my friend Martina and told her everything. She said she was proud of me and reminded me that Ethan manipulated me for years. The next morning my phone exploded with texts from him. Apologies turned into threats, then guilt trips. I screenshotted everything and forwarded it to Samuel Carter, who said the messages showed a clear pattern of manipulation. He explained that small claims court limits recovery, but creates a legal record and pressure to negotiate. The intercepted mail was strong evidence of intent. He said this would not be easy, but it was possible. And for the first time since discovering the truth, I felt like I was not powerless. 2 days later, I met with Alana Brooks, a financial advisor who specialized in recovery after major losses. She reviewed every document and calculated the damage. $180,000 in direct payments, $90,000 in lost investment growth, $150,000 in lost property value, $40,000 in penalties and taxes, lost compound interest and reduced Social Security benefits. The total reached $460,000. She showed me projections and explained I would need to work at least 10 more years. My retirement would be tight and careful. Seeing my life reduced to numbers made everything real, and the tears came quietly. Alana did not rush me and told me I was not alone 3 days later. Samuel called again and said one of Ethan's roommates, Tyler, wanted to talk. He felt guilty and had records from the business partnership showing how the money was spent. I met Tyler at a coffee shop near campus and he apologized repeatedly. He showed me organized financial records, $120,000 on DJ equipment, $40,000 on the luxury apartment and Tesla lease, the rest on trips and festivals. The business made only $30,000 total. The famous collaboration was just an email exchange. Tyler said Ethan exaggerated everything and convinced people his big break was always coming. He offered to testify and I believed him because his shock and shame were genuine. I took copies of everything and drove straight to Samuel's office. Samuel spread the documents across his desk and smiled after reviewing them. This changed everything. Now we could prove intent and trace every dollar. 2 weeks after serving Ethan the papers, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. It was my ex-husband Michael, Ethan's father, who had been absent for years. Ethan asked him for money and he wanted to hear my side first. I told him everything and he admitted Ethan pulled a similar lie on him years ago. He offered $5,000 to help with legal fees. Martina said I should accept, and I did, knowing it was the least he could do after staying silent when Samuel sent all the evidence to Ethan's lawyer. They requested mediation instead of trial. It meant they knew their position was weak. Samuel explained mediation could lead to a real settlement and accountability. I agreed, even though part of me wanted court. And as we prepared, I knew this was only the beginning of rebuilding my life, not just financially but emotionally. The story did not end with confrontation, it was only starting to unfold. In the weeks leading up to mediation, I realized the anger was no longer the loudest thing inside me. It was exhaustion that settled deep into my bones, the kind that comes from years of giving without question and finally understanding how little was left. I kept going to work and doing my job, but everything felt heavier. Every double shift I remembered why I worked them in the first place and how those sacrifices were twisted into something selfish and dishonest. I replayed every conversation with Ethan in my head and saw the manipulation clearly now. The pride he used like a lever, the guilt he applied with precisions. Samuel called often to prepare me for what was coming, and explained how mediation worked. No judge, no jury, just a room where the truth would finally be spoken out loud and documented. He told me to focus on facts, not emotion, because emotion was Ethan's strongest weapon. Martina came over one evening with takeout and sat at my tiny kitchen table while we practiced responses. She pretended to cry and apologize like Ethan did, then switched to anger and threats. Each time I stayed calm and repeated the same truth, that the money was stolen through lies and that accountability mattered. Di met with a therapist named Claire Morgan on Martina recommendation because I knew I needed help processing more than numbers and documents. Her office was quiet with soft lighting, and she listened without interrupting as I explained everything. When she asked what hurt the most, I surprised myself by saying it was not the money. It was realizing the son I thought I raised never truly existed. Claire explained that I was grieving to losses, my financial future and the relationship I believed I had with Ethan, and that grief does not disappear just because legal action begins. As mediation approached, Ethan's messages slowed and then stopped entirely. The silence felt different from before, not peaceful but tense, like the calm before a storm. Samuel finalized our demands: acknowledgement of fraud in writing, a long-term repayment plan, immediate liquidation of expensive assets, and strict boundaries on contact. He warned me Ethan's lawyer would fight hardest against admitting fraud because it carried consequences beyond this case. But we had enough evidence to push back hard. The morning of mediation, I barely slept. My stomach churned as I drove downtown to the neutral office building where it would take place. Samuel met me in the lobby carrying a thick folder filled with years of my life reduced to paper. The conference room was bright with long windows and a large table that felt too formal for something this personal. The mediator, a calm woman named Denise Reynolds, explained the process and rules. Then Ethan's lawyer arrived alone and arranged his papers carefully like armor. Ethan came in last and for the first time. Since everything fell apart, he looked small to me. He wore simple clothes instead of designer streetwear, and avoided my eyes as he sat beside his lawyer. When Denise asked him to speak first, he delivered a carefully rehearsed apology about being young and overwhelmed. He called it poor judgment and said he panicked instead of being honest. He never used words like fraud or theft and framed everything as fear of disappointing me. I felt a familiar hollow feeling recognizing the performance. When it was my turn, I unfolded the statement I wrote with Claire help. My hands shook, but my voice stayed steady. I spoke about double shifts and swollen feet, about rice and beans dinners, about cashing out my retirement and selling property because I believed in my son's future as a doctor. I described the 3 years of lies, intercepted mail, fake photos, and invented professors. I talked about discovering the luxury penthouse and parties while I lived small and careful. I explained how his choices forced me to work a decade longer than planned and stripped away the security I earned. When I finished, the room was silent. Denise looked directly at Ethan and asked if he understood the harm he caused. He whispered yes without lifting his head. His lawyer tried to redirect the conversation toward settlement numbers, but Denise stopped him and pressed Ethan to respond to the impact. After a long, uncomfortable pause, Ethan admitted he knew was wrong the whole time and convinced himself success would erase the lies. Anger flared in me, but I stayed silent as Denise reminded him fear does not justify deception. Samuel presented our proposal calmly. $40,000 repaid over years, immediate sale of equipment for an upfront payment, written acknowledgement of fraud, consequences for missed payments. Ethan lawyer countered with a lower amount, and no admission. Samuel refused without hesitation. Denise called for a break, and Samuel explained quietly that this resistance meant we were close. Ethan's side was trying to limit damage but knew their position was weak. During the break, Ethan attempted to approach me in the hallway, but Samuel stepped between us, reminding him of the rules. I stood by the water cooler, hands shaking not from fear this time but from the weight of finality. When we returned to the room, negotiations stretched on for hours. Offers rose slowly as evidence was laid out again and again. Tyler willingness to testify. Bank records tracing every dollar. Proof of intercepted mail. Eventually, Ethan's lawyer face tightened and his tone changed. Reality setting in by late afternoon, an agreement was reached. $40,000 repaid over 8 years. $15,000 upfront from selling equipment. Mandatory financial counseling. Written acknowledgement of fraud and deception. And no contact unless I initiated it. If he missed 3 consecutive payments, we could pursue criminal charges. Denise read the terms carefully and asked if we agreed. I said yes, without hesitation. Ethan paused, then agreed in a barely audible voice, signing his name with a trembling hand. Walking out into the sunlight afterward felt surreal. Samuel told me this was a strong outcome given how often parents walk away with nothing. I knew I would never recover everything, but the acknowledgement mattered as much as the money. Accountability was now permanent and documented. 2 weeks later, the first deposit appeared in my account from the equipment sale, and I cried quietly, not from joy but from relief that reality was finally aligning with words. I opened a new retirement account at a different bank and transferred the money immediately. This account was mine alone, protected and invisible to everyone else. Alana helped me restructure my finances and showed me how even small, consistent steps could rebuild what was lost. The numbers were still intimidating, but no longer hopeless. I reduced my extra shifts to 1 per week, giving my body room to breathe for the first time in years. Ethan. First monthly payment arrived on time, and I stared at it longer than I expected, feeling a complicated mix of relief, sadness, and distance. I spoke with Claire about it, and she reminded me that healing does not mean reconciliation. Boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. Over time, my days stopped revolving around waiting for messages or payments. Life began to widen again around me. Few months later, Samuel forwarded a message from Ethan requesting permission to apologize properly. I was not ready and said so without guilt. Claire supported that choice and reminded me that I controlled the pace of any future contact. Healing did not require rushing toward forgiveness. It required safety and self-respect. As months passed, the routine of payments became background noise instead of a source of anxiety. Alana showed me updated projections, and for the first time since the truth came out, I could imagine a future that did not feel like survival. I began browsing property listings again, cautiously and without desperation, rebuilding not from fear but from intention. And I understood that this part of the story was no longer about Ethan's choices. It was about reclaiming my own life piece by piece. Claiming my own life piece by piece. As time passed, the emotional weight shifted again. The sharp pain dulled into something steadier and heavier, like carrying a loaded backpack everywhere I went. The settlement existed on paper, but the consequences lived in my body. Every shift at the hospital reminded me that I was still paying for choices that were never mine. Yet there was a strange sense of control now. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. And that difference mattered more than I expected. Continued meeting with Claire every week, and slowly the conversations changed. We talked less about Ethan and more about me, about who I was before everything revolved around being a provider and a fixer. She asked me what I enjoyed before my life narrowed into work and sacrifice. The question caught me off guard because I could not remember clearly. I realized how long it had been since I allowed myself anything that did not serve someone else at work. My supervisor noticed the change before I did. She told me I seemed more present, less distracted. I was no longer checking my phone constantly or replaying conversations in my head. My focus returned to my patients and my team. A few weeks later, she offered me a charge nurse position with a modest pay increase and more responsibility. I accepted, knowing the extra income would help my recovery and also give me a sense of forward move. And I met again to review progress, and she showed me how the settlement payments combined with my increased salary were slowly rebuilding my foundation. She reminded me that consistency mattered more than speed. This was not about fixing everything quickly but about making sure it could not be broken again. We discussed safeguards and separation of accounts and legal protections. Lessons learned the hardest way possible. Lee joined a support group Claire recommended for parents who experienced financial abuse from adult children. Walking into that first meeting felt terrifying but necessary. Sitting in a circle of strangers who understood without explanation was unexpectedly comforting. I listened to stories that mirrored mine in different forms. Homes lost, credit ruined, inheritances drained. I shared my story and felt shame loosen its grip when others nodded in recognition. One father spoke about how his son fabricated medical emergencies to get money. Another mother lost her late husband's insurance payout to a fake startup. Hearing these stories did not make me feel lucky, but it made me feel less alone. The facilitator reminded us that trust is not a flaw and love is not a weakness. Exploitation says everything about the person who chooses it and nothing about the one who offered help. 6 months into the payment plan, I experienced my first real scare. One morning I checked my account and the monthly deposit was not there. My stomach dropped instantly and fear rushed in before logic could catch up. I called Samuel in a panic and he calmly reminded me of the agreement. 3 consecutive missed payments were required before action. He told me to breathe and wait. 3 days later the payment arrived along with an email explanation about an unexpected expense. I forwarded everything to Samuel, who logged it and reassured me the protections worked exactly as designed. The incident shook me more than I expected and I brought it to Claire, who helped me unpack why it triggered such a strong reaction. She explained that betrayal conditions the nervous system to expect danger even when safeguards exist. To counter that constant tension, I made small changes for myself. I stopped picking up extra shifts beyond what was necessary. I took walks after work, instead of collapsing on the couch. Martina convinced me to take a weekend trip with her to a beach town we loved as kids. It was the first vacation I took in years, and standing near the water reminded me that life existed beyond court documents and bank statements. During that trip, Martina told me she was proud of how I handled everything and said she saw strength in me I never acknowledged. Hearing that from someone who knew my whole history mattered more than I expected. It helped rewrite the narrative I had carried about myself from someone who was naive to someone who survived and adapted back home. I started researching rental properties. Again, cautiously and deliberately, not from desperation but from strategy. I made spreadsheets comparing prices and rental potential. I promised myself I would never again make a major financial decision based on emotion or pressure. Every step would be slow and protected. Around this time, Samuel forwarded a message from Tyler, letting me know he had started a new legitimate business and was doing well. He thanked me again for not involving him legally and said the experience taught him hard lessons about integrity and accountability. I wished him well and let the thread end. His path was no longer part of my story. Therapy sessions became bi-weekly as the acute pain softened. Claire noted that I spoke about Ethan less frequently and with less intensity. Some days I did not think about him at all, and that felt like progress. Other days memories surfaced unexpectedly, and I allowed them without judgment. Healing was not linear, and I was learning to accept that. Nearly 2 years after the mediation, Samuel contacted me again to inform me Ethan had requested to confirm the final payment schedule and ensure everything was documented properly. The information stirred something complicated inside me, a quiet acknowledgement that he was following through consistently. Not enough to rebuild trust, but enough to recognize accountability in action. I discussed this with Claire, who helped me separate acknowledgement from reconciliation. I could recognize responsible behavior without reopening wounds or changing boundaries. Growth did not erase harm, but it mattered that I no longer felt consumed by anger when hearing his name 3 years after everything unraveled. I signed closing papers on a small condo near the university. It was not glamorous and needed work, but it generated steady income and represented something rebuilt from intention, not sacrifice. Martina celebrated with me over dinner, and for the first time in a long while, I felt proud without bitterness. Ashalana reviewed my accounts and showed me real progress. My retirement savings were growing again, and projections no longer felt like a warning but a plan. I would not retire early, but I would retire with stability and dignity. Something that once felt stolen forever was slowly being reclaimed at the hospital. I began mentoring a younger nurse named Rebecca, who reminded me of myself years ago, eager, generous, and quick to help family financially. When she mentioned supporting her brother through school, I shared a carefully measured version of my story, not to scare her but to encourage boundaries. She listened thoughtfully and thanked me, and I hoped the lesson would land before loss was required to teach it. Tears passed, with payments arriving reliably and fading into the background of my life. Automatic transfers handled everything, and I stopped checking obsessively. That mental freedom was one of the greatest victories. I was no longer tethered emotionally to each deposit. It was restitution, not connection. One afternoon Samuel called to say Ethan was nearing the end of his obligation and wanted confirmation of the final months. The consistency surprised even him. After hanging up, I sat quietly reflecting on how much had changed, not in Ethan but in me. My life was no longer defined by reacting to his choices when the final payment arrived. I did not feel closure in a dramatic sense. There were no tears or relief floods, just a quiet acknowledgement that one chapter had ended. The harm remained part of my history, but it no longer dictated my present. I had rebuilt enough to stand on my own terms. Looking back, I no longer saw myself as someone who was fooled, but as someone who acted decisively once the truth was clear. I protected myself when it mattered and refused to enable harm disguised as love. That lesson reshaped every part of my life and carried me forward into something steadier and stronger than what I lost. After the final payment settled quietly into my account, life did not suddenly feel complete or healed. Instead, it felt open in a way I was not used to, like standing in a room after the furniture has been moved out and realizing how much space there actually is. For years my days were shaped around reacting to Ethan's choices or repairing damage from them. Now there was nothing immediate demanding my attention, and that absence felt unsettling before it felt peaceful. Claire and I talked about this strange emotional vacuum during one of our sessions. She explained that when long-term stress ends, the nervous system often struggles with the quiet. Chaos becomes familiar and calm can feel suspicious. She encouraged me to fill the space intentionally, rather than waiting for something else to occupy it. Not with distractions, but with things that belonged to me. Started small. I changed my routine at home, moved furniture around, painted the living room a warm neutral color. Things I had postponed for years because money and energy were always reserved for Ethan's needs. Each small decision made without consulting anyone else felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I was no longer asking permission emotionally or financially. At work, the charge nurse role continued to challenge me in ways that felt healthy rather than draining. Managing a team required boundaries and clear communication, skills I had learned painfully in my personal life but could now apply professionally. My supervisor praised my leadership style and told me the younger nurses trusted me. Hearing that made me realize how much I had grown. Alana and I met quarterly now instead of monthly. Our conversations shifted from damage control to long-term planning. We discussed diversifying income streams and protecting assets legally. She helped me establish a trust for my properties and retirement accounts, so everything was structured clearly and securely. The idea of protection no longer felt paranoid. It felt wise. The condo near the university stayed fully rented and the income became a reliable supplement. I used part of it to fund small repairs and improvements and saved the rest. The satisfaction came not from the money alone but from knowing every dollar was earned through informed choices rather than sacrifice born from One of my support group meetings, a new member shared her story and it mirrored the early stages of mine. So closely it made my chest tighten. She spoke about sending money every month to a child with vague explanations and constant urgency. Afterward she asked me how I knew when to stop. The question stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Realized there was no single moment of knowing. No flashing warning sign that made everything clear. What mattered was what happened when the truth appeared. Whether you turned away from it or faced it directly. I shared that with her at the next meeting and watched her absorb it quietly. Hoping she would act before loss forced her hand around. This time, Martina suggested we plan something bigger than a weekend trip. Something symbolic. We decided on a modest international vacation. Nothing extravagant but far enough to mark a new chapter. Planning it felt strange and exhilarating. I had not looked forward to anything personal in years. As the departure date approached, I felt a familiar pull of guilt creep in. The old voice whispering that I should not spend money on myself, that security should come first. Claire helped me unpack that reflex and reminded me that responsible planning and self-deprivation are not the same thing. Enjoying life does not undo discipline. The trip was simple and beautiful. Long walks, quiet cafes, unfamiliar streets. No pressure to perform or provide. Martina and I talked late into the evenings about our lives and choices. About how resilience often looks ordinary from the outside. Standing there far from home, I felt something loosen inside me that I did not realize was still clenched. When I returned home, I noticed how different my apartment felt. Not smaller or lonely but settled. I had built a life that fit me now rather than one shaped around someone else's potential. The difference was subtle but profound. Several months later, Samuel contacted me again. Not with legal news but with a courtesy update. Ethan had completed his required financial counseling and requested confirmation that all obligations were officially closed. Everything was in order, and Samuel assured me there were no loose ends. After the call, I sat quietly thinking about how much power that chapter once held over me and how little it did. Now I did not feel compelled to reach out or respond in any way. There was no urgency or longing, just a neutral awareness that something had ended fully. Closure arrived not with conversation but with distance and consistency. At the hospital, I continued mentoring Rebecca and others like her. I found fulfillment in guiding without rescuing, teaching without sacrificing myself. One afternoon, Rebecca thanked me for encouraging her to set clear boundaries with her brother. She said it was difficult but necessary and that she felt stronger for it. Hearing that felt like purpose drawn from Pana's years past. My life grew fuller in quiet ways. Friendships deepened. Routines stabilized. Financial fear loosened its grip. Alana projections showed steady progress and realistic comfort ahead. Not luxury but security earned through intention and care. One evening, I received a letter forwarded through Samuel's office. It was from Ethan, written carefully and without urgency. He wrote about working a regular job consistently, about finishing counseling and understanding the harm he caused beyond money. He did not ask for forgiveness or contact, only acknowledged responsibility and expressed hope that I was well. I read the letter several times, searching for manipulation and found none. Only restraint and accountability. I placed it in a folder with the rest of the documents and did not respond, not out of anger but clarity. Reconciliation was not a requirement for healing. Claire and I talked about forgiveness during our final sessions. She explained that forgiveness is not a gift given to restore access. It is a decision to release the weight of carrying harm forward. It can exist without reconciliation and without trust. That distinction mattered. I realized I had already forgiven parts of the story without naming it, not by excusing behavior but by refusing to let it define my present. Ethan's actions were now part of my history, not my identity. 5 years after everything collapsed, I stood in my second rental property signing final paperwork. It was smaller than the first, but well located and solid. As I held the keys, I felt pride that was clean and uncomplicated. This was built slowly, carefully, and without sacrificing myself. Alana reviewed my accounts soon after, and showed me how far I had come. 2 income properties, steady retirement contributions, and 0 debt. I would retire later than originally planned, but with independence and peace. That mattered more than any timeline I once imagined. I thought back to the woman I was before the truth surfaced. Exhausted, anxious, shrinking her life to fund someone else's illusion. I did not judge her anymore. She did the best she could with the information she had. But I no longer lived there now. My days were defined by choice rather than obligation, by boundaries rather than guilt, by intention rather than fear. The betrayal reshaped me, but it did not destroy me. It forced me to grow in directions I never would have chosen willingly. The story was no longer about what Ethan took from me. It was about what I rebuilt and protected afterward. The strength I discovered was not loud or dramatic. It was steady and enduring and entirely my own. As I looked toward the future, I no longer measured it against what was lost. I measured it by what was possible. And for the first time in a very long time, that possibility felt wide open and firmly within my control. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than forced. My mornings began without dread, and my nights no longer replayed old conversations, searching for missed clues. The anxiety that once lived in my chest softened into awareness and then slowly into trust in myself. Not in others' promises, but in my own ability to respond when reality demanded it. I stopped marking time by Ethan's actions or payments or silence. Those markers faded into the background of a life that was finally centered where it belonged. On my work, my health, my choices. The hospital became a place of purpose again, instead of obligation. I trained new nurses, mentored those who reminded me of myself, and quietly passed on lessons without preaching or bitterness. My second rental property filled quickly, and the tenants treated it with respect. Every deposit felt like proof that rebuilding did not require desperation, only patience and clarity. Alana continued to guide me with calm precision, and each meeting reinforced that my future was no longer fragile. It was structured, layered, and protected. I learned to enjoy my weekends without guilt. Sometimes they were productive, and sometimes they were quiet. I read books that had nothing to do with finance or self-improvement. I cooked meals that were simple but satisfying. I let rest exist without justification, a luxury I once denied myself because survival demanded constant motion. Martina remained a steady presence, and we laughed more than we talked about the past. When we did revisit those years, it was without the sharp edges of pain, more like acknowledging whether we survived together. She told me once that she admired how I rebuilt without becoming hardened. That comment stayed with me because it captured something important. Claire and I eventually ended our regular sessions with intention and gratitude. She reminded me that growth does not mean forgetting but integrating. I carried the lessons with me quietly and applied them in ways that felt natural. Boundaries became instinct rather than effort. Discernment replaced fear. One afternoon, while walking through the grocery store where everything unraveled years ago, I paused unexpectedly, not from panic but from reflection. I stood in the same aisle and felt nothing dramatic, only recognition of how far I had come. The place held no power over me anymore. Samuel checked in once more to confirm all records were closed and archived properly. His tone was professional but warm, and he congratulated me on seeing the process through without compromise. I thanked him for treating my case with seriousness and dignity, something that mattered deeply when so many dismiss family betrayal as private or shameful. I never reached out to Ethan, and he never attempted contact beyond what was permitted. The distance felt natural rather than forced. I did not fantasize about reconciliation or fear it either. If it came someday, it would be on terms grounded in reality, not hope. And if it never came, that was also acceptable. There were moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, not for the money but for the years I thought I was sharing a dream with my son. Those moments passed more easily now. I allowed them without spiraling, understanding that mourning a version of someone does not mean longing for the harm they caused. As retirement grew closer, the fear that once haunted me loosened its grip entirely. Alana showed me projections that were conservative but stable. no extravagance, just security and autonomy. I could choose how to spend my time, and that choice was priceless. I reduced my hours gradually and focused on training leadership within my team. Stepping back without guilt felt like another milestone. I had given enough, and now I was allowed to receive ease. The body that once endured double shifts without rest finally began to recover. On my last birthday before semi-retirement, Martina organized a small dinner with close friends. No speeches, no drama, just warmth and laughter. Sitting there, surrounded by people who knew the truth of my story and respected my boundaries, I felt a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with obligation. One evening I organized old files and documents, preparing to store them permanently. I came across the first spreadsheet listing every payment I sent Ethan years ago. I studied it briefly and then closed the folder without emotion. The numbers no longer defined. May realized then that accountability had not only changed Ethan's trajectory but reshaped my own. Choosing not to enable again was the moment everything shifted. Saying no was not rejection, it was self-preservation. That lesson informed every decision afterward. I no longer viewed generosity as limitless giving. I understood now that true care includes protection, for myself and for others. Rescuing robs people of consequence and self-respect. That clarity became part of my identity's retirement approached. I planned a long trip on my own, not to escape anything but to celebrate independence. Planning it felt joyful rather than anxious. I trusted myself fully with logistics, finances, and solitude. On the morning I officially reduced my schedule, I stood in the hospital parking lot and breathed deeply. Gratitude filled the space where fear once lived. I had survived betrayal, rebuilt stability, and emerged wiser without losing compassion. The life I built was quieter than the one I once imagined, but infinitely more solid. It was not fueled by illusion or promises, but by action and intention. No one could manipulate it because it was anchored in truth. I sometimes thought of the young version of myself who believed sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. I wished I could tell her that love does not require self-destruction, but she learned that lesson through experience and survived it. Now, when I offer help, it comes with clarity and limits. When I invest, it is with information and protection. When I love, it is without abandoning myself. Those distinctions changed everything. Looking back, the betrayal that once felt like the end became the catalyst for a life rebuilt on honesty and self-respect. I did not win because I recovered money. I won because I reclaimed agency. The story ends not with reconciliation or forgiveness, but with peace earned through boundaries. With a future shaped by intention rather than fear. I protected myself when it mattered most and carried that strength forward. Nothing was taken from me that I could not rebuild in a new form. The foundation is different now, but stronger for having been tested. And I walk into the years ahead, knowing exactly who I am and what I will never surrender again.